Okay, so this is learning objective 1, the fundamental concepts. Basically, there are 5 steps to the process of recognizing revenue. You have to identify the contract, identify any performance obligations involved. There could be one or more than one. Figure out the transaction price. You have to allocate that transaction price to all the separate performance obligations, if there are more than one. And then you recognize the revenue as each performance obligation is satisfied. Okay, so I think the book uses a contract, uses an example of Boeing. They signed the contract to sell some airplanes. So it's easy to identify the contract. They agreed to provide, $100 million worth of airplanes, or an airplane to the customer. There's no separate performance obligation there because they're just set up to, or they're contracted to deliver one airplane. Transaction price is stated at $100 million. So the allocation of price would be, that would be not applicable to this because there's only one performance obligation. And then you recognize the revenue when the plane is delivered to the customer, when the performance obligation is satisfied. So you could simplify it a little bit and say you stopped at Dunkies in the morning to get some coffee, so, or a chocolate-covered donut. So say you're going for the chocolate-covered donut. You'd go in, I'd like a chocolate-covered donut. They say, okay. So that's a contract, all right? It's not written, it's an oral contract, but each side kind of knows their obligations, and you're gonna plan to pay for the chocolate donut, and they're gonna plan to give it to you. So is there a contract? Yeah, it's a verbal contract based on customary business practice. Okay, the performance obligation, give the customer the donut. Okay, transaction price, we'll say it's $250. The allocation is not an issue because you just bought the donut, and you recognize the revenue when the customer pays. So the performance obligation has been satisfied. The customer has the donut, and Dunkies has the money. So for most transactions, it's going to be a lot, fairly straightforward, but the whole chapter is on the more complicated transactions. Okay, so what I want to focus on for the rest of this video is just the identifying the contract part, step 1 of the whole process. You really have to get down what's a contract, because if you don't have a contract, you can't recognize the revenue. So a contract, an agreement between 2 or more parties that creates enforceable rights and obligations. For these purposes, it does not have to be in writing. It can be oral, it can be written, or it can be just customary business practice. And it exists if it creates rights and obligations enforceable against both parties. Okay, so there's no contract if either party can terminate it at any time without penalty. Okay, so they have to be committed to the contract, and it has to be enforceable against them. There's also no contract if it's not likely that you'll collect it. So if collectability is an issue, in other words, if you don't think you're really going to get paid, you can't book the revenue because it's really not a contract. So criteria to be met for a contract. The parties have approved it in writing, orally, or in accordance with customary business practice. Okay, so you order the donut, they say, oh sure, I'll get you the donut, it's $250, that's a contract. Okay, the entity can identify the payment terms, that makes sense, and then the contract has commercial substance. This is kind of a tricky one. Commercial substance is defined as when the risk, timing, or amount of cash flows are going to change as a result of the transaction. So the easiest way to figure this out is to say, okay, well, what would not have commercial substance? Say you have 2 car dealers. I like to use a Lexus dealer because it's fun to say. Anyway, yeah, so Lexus dealers. So if one Lexus dealer has a red Lexus and the customer wants a blue one, and they exchange Lexuses, with each other, that has no commercial substance because the cash flows will not change. They're just changing it, to expedite a sale. So that has no commercial substance. You may want to look a little bit more into that so that you have an understanding of it. Okay, so yeah, it has to have commercial substance. You can assume for the homework that they probably have commercial substance. And then the last thing is it's probable the entity will collect the consideration. In other words, they'll get the payment. So what if the criteria are not met? And so if I use the example, if you've got a real estate developer that enters into a contract with a person who wants to start a restaurant, and this person has no experience running a restaurant, the space that they're leasing from the developer is in, there's already a bunch of really good restaurants there, a highly competitive area, that sort of thing. So the customer pays a non-refundable deposit for $50,000 and then does financing with the developer for the rest of the $950,000. How much revenue could the developer book there? Well, the threshold of collectability is not met on that whole $950,000. It's unlikely that he's going to collect it because the person has no experience running a restaurant and it's a highly competitive area. So so chances are you could not recognize that $950,000 as revenue. The $50,000, if it's a non-refundable deposit, that's a separate matter. Okay, so yeah, the first question that you have to ask is this a contract? And one criteria is not met. It's unlikely the customer will be able to pay the consideration to which the developer is entitled. So the ability to pay is in doubt. Okay, so the building would have to stay on the developer's books until, in the unlikely event that the customer was able to pay it off, or maybe could be recognized as it was paid off. Okay, so they go on in the book to sort of do an extended example of the 5-step process, and I'm still talking about really the identifying contract part of it. So they talk about the customer orders a large coffee costing $3, pays the barista, who gives them the coffee. And so you have to think in terms of, okay, is there a valid contract? And it may seem silly in this case. And yes, it has commercial substance. Both cash flows will change for the, the customer and for bean coffee here. Both parties have approved the contract. It's like cash for coffee. Yeah, that's kind of what it is expecting. Each party, the customer has the right to get the coffee. The Dunkin's or the Bean, sorry, has the right to get paid for it. The payment terms are identified. It's right up on the wall there, and it's probable that it'll be collected. So you do have a valid contract there. If we went through the rest of the 5 steps here, just to see how that would go, the performance obligations are easily identifiable here. And the rights of and then the transaction price we don't have to allocate it because there's just one thing. And then you recognize the revenue when the performance obligation is satisfied. Okay, so now this gets you into a whole different concept of the control of the good or service has to pass to the customer. So conditions for control of the coffee to pass to the customer, and some of these have to be met. Bean has the right to receive payment. Yeah, Bean has transferred the legal title. Well, it doesn't, it just passed the coffee. Bean has transferred the physical possession of the coffee. The customer has all the risks and reward. Yeah, now the customer's got the coffee. If they spill it, it's on them, and the customer has accepted the asset. So those would be conditions which would say, yeah, the control of this asset has passed from the seller to the buyer. And so Bean recognizes the revenue when the customer gets the coffee. All right, so that's sort of the, is there a contract part of it? And you want to keep in mind, you want to sort of, as you're going through this, summarize each section as you go along. So you can only recognize revenue on a contract if both parties have approved it, writing, orally, or customary business practice. You have to be able to identify the rights that each party are entitled to regarding the goods and services transferred. You have to be able to figure out the payment terms, what's the amount of the payment, how does that work. And it has to have commercial substance, meaning the risk, amount, timing, the cash flows will change. And it's probable that it will be collected. So that's kind of focusing on the contract part of it. Next we'll talk about the next step of the process, which would be those performance obligations. Okay.